Today we are going to talk about language and power. We are going to look at what is power, how to prevent the use of power in the classrooms, and we are going to look at solutions. So what is power? So power is primarily when we have privileged access to social resources such as education, knowledge and wealth. And when we have this kind of access, it provides us authority, it provides us status, influence, and it also enables us to dominate, coerce and control subordinate groups. Now there are two traditions of research on power. One is mainstream, when you use the corrective power of the state and its institutions. And here power is seen as dominance, where you try to secure the compliance of others even in the face of resistance. And this happens primarily in undemocratic societies. And the second stream tradition is primarily when it is concerned with the significance of the persuasive influence of power. So Gramsci actually talks about the second stream when he talks about hegemony. And his concept of hegemony describes the mechanism through which the dominant groups of society succeed in persuading subordinate groups to accept the former's own moral, political, cultural values and institutions. So power is not used coercively but routinely. So a very important factor in this process is consent. The subordinate groups consent to the social order and they regard it as universally beneficial and even commonsensical. So how do you do that? That is done by constructing political alliances. So the ruling group sort of builds and maintains political alliances. So many people sort of agree with them. And then the second is by generating consent among the population. And of course, the third is where you build a capacity of coercion, which you don't really use it, but you have this capacity of coercion, which is through the police, the courts, the prisons and the military. And this sort of is enough to make people behave. Then we have Foucault's model. And Foucault sees power as productive. It's a sort of complex and continuously evolving web of social and discursive power relations. And here people negotiate, they contest, and they sort of absolutely evolve a kind of web. And power here is never fixed and stable. Then we come to actually what is fair clock, but before that, hold your thought, because we are going to talk about ordinary conversation. So what happens when we have a conversation with each other? We all tacitly agree to cooperate and talk. We all contribute to this interaction on an equal basis. We have the same discoursal rights, we have the same obligations. But if you look at institutions, what happens in an institution? There is of course language, and we'll talk about the language in a minute, but primarily institutions are associated with physical buildings such as schools, hospitals, media organizations, prisons or courts of law. And here you find a sort of asymmetrical speaking rights and obligations. And these institutions are actually very closely linked to power and serve the interests of certain powerful groups. So the powerful group in an institution can constrain the contribution of the less powerful participants in terms of spoken discourse. So Fairclough talks of 4 devices that are used to do this. So I said Fairclough has his own model. So he has, where the institution is concerned, 4 devices to assert power. And this is quite commonly used in classrooms. So I want teachers to be very aware of this. One is interruption. So here the dominant group can dismiss or ignore the contributions which they consider irrelevant. And here the dominant speaker is the the teacher. So she can dismiss a child's contribution, she can ignore a child's contribution, and this is what we keep telling our teachers not to ignore. She can also enforce explicitness, and this is probably a good device, because what happens is when we push our children and tell them, look, this is not clear, please be more clear, we are actually demanding speakers to make their statement less ambivalent, and in a sense what we're trying to do is help the children to come up with clarity. So this is something that we can use. Then of course all teachers control the topic, as in all institutions the topic is controlled by the teacher, but here again we want the teacher to have the children as well have their say where topics are concerned. So where formulation, so then the last is formulation. Formulation is primarily summarizing, glossing, giving a gist of the previous speaker's statements or of the class's statement. And this serves to check an understanding of what has transpired from this interaction. It's also a big controlling device, because if you have an agenda, then you make the children or you make the participants accept your version. So this is quite a powerful device. So but this can be used in the classroom as well, all these devices. And what we should do is make these devices as children friendly as possible, as learner centered as possible. Then I want to actually come to the next business of language and power, which is language versus dialect. Now, a language has many varieties, as we all know. It has geographical varieties, which are called dialects, social varieties, sociolects, gender-based varieties, age-based varieties, situational or stylistic varieties. Now, when we talk about language and the varieties of the same language, we always talk about the language as being something superior. But here I want to tell you that there is no linguistic criteria for differentiating between a language and a dialect or vernacular. There is nothing in a standard language which makes it more superior than any dialect. Of course, there is structural similarity or dissimilarities which tell different languages apart. For example, Chinese and English are very apart in terms of their linguistic structures. They're very dissimilar. Hindi, Urdu and Punjabi are structurally and lexically very similar, while you'll have Kannada and Marathi, which are structurally almost the same but lexically dissimilar. But what I want you to remember is that the powerful community, the verbal mode of communication of a powerful community or a powerful people may be called a language, and that a community not enjoying power may be called a dialect. So it has nothing to do with the language per se. It is about how much power one wields. And that doesn't mean that you cannot talk of separate languages, but when you talk about languages and dialects, be very, very certain that this is all about political power. Then let's talk about this process of standardization. Now, this also demonstrates the nexus that exists between language and power in any society. So you have different varieties of a language in a geographical area, but which language do you think is chosen, or which variety do you think is chosen? It is the variety which is associated with the rich and the powerful, which is selected. So that's the first step. Then, in the second step of standardization, you have elaboration of functions of the selected variety. So it is this language is extended to all places of power, that is education, medicine, technology, administration, law, high status jobs. So it's in all these spheres. So you won't have people speak Awadhi or Bhojpuri in education or medicine, but you would have Khadi Boli, for instance, or you will have English instead of Hindi sometimes. So it's all about status and power. And third is codification. That is, The rules, spelling, words of the standard variety are codified and enshrined in grammars and dictionaries. So then it comes down to the correctness and purity, which are the defining features of a standard variety. And any deviation from the so-called standard is incorrect or dialectical. And this is because of this asymmetrical power equations. So it is through this processes of standardization, which is selection, elaboration of function, codifications in grammars and dictionaries, that the powerful and the rich people get an additional instrument to wield their power. Let me be very dramatic. 90% of the languages that are part of our oral tradition are likely to be extinct by the end of the century. So, which is a very, very traumatic and sad thing, because who are the bearers of these languages? They are the indigenous people and the migrants that are the bearers of this linguistic and cultural diversity, and their languages are going to get extinct. And remember that when a language and culture die, a very important aspect of a set of people die. And this will in fact lead to the disappearance of an immense amount of linguistic and cultural diversity. So we have to be really, really careful about what we are doing with this process of standardization and business of languages and dialects. So why does this happen? Because all these languages are dubbed as traditional, backward, inferior. They are deprived of resources for their development and use. The verbal mode of the powerful community is called language, and the community not enjoying power is called dialect. The children are psychologically prohibited from speaking or wanting to speak their own language. And after a while, they want to identify with the dominant group, which is a really sad thing. And there is physical punishment for speaking mother tongue. And the rationale is that how will the children learn the dominant language? So the children are, in a sense, punished in order to help them because they're speaking in their mother tongue. And remember, if a teacher insults or humiliates the languages of the child in the classroom, then his or her educational career almost comes to a stop that day. He or she may stop even coming to school, because what is the teacher doing? She's hurting their identity. So this whole process of labeling some groups as possessing a language, other groups as possessing a dialect is great harm done. And also, by not offering mother tongue medium maintenance oriented education to indigenous and minority children is also not at all good for society, because actually languages will die, and with that a culture will die, a narrative will die, a story will die with it. So we come up with solutions, and one is multilingualism and translanguaging. So from 1986, our education policy, the Indian education policy, has emphasized the significance of integrating children's languages into formal education. 2005 NCF also recognized the pluralities and the great need to integrate school knowledge with the social, economic, and the ethnic milieu of children. So the language was seen of the child, the language of the child was seen as the axiom around which the child's world was constructed. So India has paid a lot of attention to languages and multilingualism, and which is a very good thing. As Garcia says, in multilingual societies like India, children bring with them a number of ways of languaging when they come to school. And the NCF 2005 has provided the space when it says that language teaching needs to be multilingual, not only in terms of the number of languages offered to children, but also in terms of evolving strategies that would use the multilingual classroom as a resource So very important point, how to use the multilingual classroom as a resource. But there is no reference to the hybrid linguistic structures and fluid language practices in the curriculum. So what is happening is, the goal is like, okay, we have the first language, then we have the second language and the third and fourth, and we expect a monolingual-like proficiency for each of these languages, which is not authentic and also not feasible given the multiplicity of languaging practices that are prevalent in the Indian context. So actually, our pedagogical stances that we do not allow hybrid structures that are part of our day-to-day conversations. So schools do not allow hybrid structures. And so while our education policy claims that it is all about multilingualism, it is actually tacitly promoting a form of monolingual multilingualism. And Mohanty actually calls it nominal form of multilingual education and claims that India is only superficially multilingual, but it is monolingual at an underlying level. Because, again, as I mentioned earlier, that the fluid and dynamic practices, which are so wonderful and beautiful, that typically characterize the nature of multilingual speakers' linguistic repertoire within the Indian context, find no resonance in the classroom. So the teachers, what do? They put a garb of monolingual speaker or educator. And because they want to give maximum exposure to students in the target language. So such a method neglects, in a sense, the languages, the multilingual resource that the children have. So the Indian classrooms, in a sense, are guided by these monolingual ideologies, and we need to get away from this thinking. So what happens is, we should probably understand what is translanguaging and how to use it in the classroom. Translanguaging refers to the act of using linguistic resources in fluid and dynamic ways, such as that the boundaries that are drawn between languages like Hindi and English are blurred, And scholars who discuss translanguaging argue that this notion of one language plus another language equal to two languages is reductive and inadequate in explaining multilingual situations. And there's a suggestion that code mixing and translating, which are normally done, should be allowed. So even in the Indian classroom, we should focus probably on the dynamic and fluid nature of the competencies that are employed by multilinguals in communicative contexts. This will give such a richness to even the classroom, which does not mean that the target language will not be taught, but it can be taught in a much more humane and multilingual way. So we should not have this paradox of an overt commitment to multilingual goals, but covert association with monolingual ideology. So, in fact, whatever the teacher may do, these languaging practices do enter classrooms. Because teachers who will prevent the students from engaging in code switching and code mixing will use translanguaging practices. Because when they have to explain a concept to the students, they have to use the mother tongue, they have to use the regional language, they have to use other languages. So some forms of translanguaging anyway enter classrooms, but it would be better if it is used without any thought of why are we doing it, are we doing the right thing, are we not doing the right thing. So if it is used naturally, it would enrich the child, it would make the child feel better, and probably language acquisition would be much more robust. Then we come to solution 2. And here again, let us try and minimize the power relation and bring a sort of critical pedagogy into the ELT or into any classroom. I've mentioned an ELT classroom, but it can be any language classroom. It can be any classroom itself. Critical pedagogy primarily is an approach to language teaching and learning which looks at the classroom essentially as part of the wider social context and is based on the argument that discrimination and marginalization that is prevalent in social systems will be reflected in the educational system as well, and it will reproduce the same biases. And what it does is it seeks to empower learners to make them think and act critically so that they can transform their lives. Because here also remember that the ideas and values of the powerful get accepted, and these are promoted at the cost of others whose voices are not powerful. Critical pedagogy seeks to transform the relations of power, which are obviously oppressive. And it is based on the idea of a just society in which people do not suffer from any kind of discrimination and marginalization and have full control of their lives. So what is the role of the learner in critical pedagogy? So as we know, learner comes to the class with enormous linguistic and cognitive potential. But remember, some of this knowledge and experience is problematic. It could be sexist, it could be casteist. So what is the teacher's role? So the teacher's role also is to do with classroom management, classroom transaction, and the physical structure. So instead of a teacher front classroom, it should be all about pair work and group work. It should be about encouraging learners to respond first. It is about giving them confidence, making sure that nothing that they say is trivial, and intervening only when it is necessary. So the teacher is not this all-powerful alien, but is actually a learner amongst learners. So let us talk about the difference between mainstream versus critical pedagogy. So in mainstream pedagogy, learning is a detached cognitive activity. But in critical pedagogy, learning is a personal thing. It's something unique to a child. So it's not something detached, but something unique to the child. In the mainstream, learning involves the mind in analysis, comprehension, and interpretation. There is no place for emotion, imagination, intuition, because this could distort objectivity. But critical pedagogy is quite different. Learning is personal. The personal cannot be detached from the learning process. One is consciously part of one's influences, of one's consequences, of one's implications. So, and all this is part of the learning process. In the mainstream, again, learning is about impartiality and neutrality. But in critical pedagogy, learning is located in the environment and conditioned by the influences of his or her context. So the context becomes very important. The personal becomes very important in critical pedagogy. Then the learning processes in mainstream are universal. Knowledge is value-free. In critical pedagogy, the knowledge that people produce or acquire is grounded in their social practice and material context. And everything is value-laden. Everything is ideological. And the learner must be encouraged to question the hidden assumption and values that come with knowledge. And so I will end here with just summing up, which is that we talked about language and power. We talked about how people have access to power and how language and dialect and standardization are all processes of this power game. And then we talked about two solutions. One was translanguaging and multilingualism, and the second was critical pedagogy. So thank you very much.